We've told you already. It's just a stray. Stop wasting our time. That was the last thing Carla heard over the radio before she turned the volume down. Her boots were soaked, her jacket heavy with rain, and the cold had begun to bite through her gloves. Somewhere behind her, the others were calling it off. Again, they'd been searching for nearly 24 hours. No signal, no flares, no heat signatures, no signs of life. But that dog, it kept showing up. She'd seen it twice already. Muddy, thin.
Pacing near the tree line like it was trying to get someone's attention, the others called it a nuisance, said it was feral and annoying in the way. They told her to ignore it. But something about the way it looked at her, it didn't want food, it didn't bark for fun, it was trying to tell her something. And somewhere deep in the forest, smoke still lingered. Somewhere the wreckage of a missing plane was out there. And maybe, just maybe, someone hadn't died in vain. Hours earlier, before the judgment, before the rain, and before the silence, a peaceful stretch of forest stood still under heavy clouds. The trees swayed gently. The forest floor was damp from an earlier storm. Birds had gone quiet, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, a scream of engines, a flash of motion in the sky, and a violent explosion tore through the treetops. A small plane, spiraling broken, slammed into the earth with unimaginable force. Trees splintered, fire erupted, smoke poured into the sky. When it was over, there was only stillness, no voices, no movement, just the quiet hiss of flame and the soft patter of rain on scorched leaves, until the sound, faint, barely audible, a baby's cry, half buried beneath a collapsed panel and a charred cushion. A tiny figure stood, Noah, barely 2 years old, his face covered in ash, lips trembling, tears cutting lines through the dirt on his cheeks. He cried, not knowing why, not knowing that his parents were gone, not knowing that he was alone in the heart of a freezing forest with no one coming for him. His voice, soft as it was, fought against the overwhelming silence. And far off, beyond the wreckage, beyond the trees, across a stream, ears perked up. A dog, thin, dirty, forgotten by people months ago. They used to call him Bentley. Now they just called him a problem, a mutt, a nuisance. But Bentley heard the cry, and he didn't wait, didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. He started moving, through mud, through cold, through fog, toward the smoke, toward the baby, because someone had to care. Someone had to go where others wouldn't. Someone had to prove that being unwanted doesn't mean being unworthy. And that is where the story begins. Just hours before the sky turned to ash and sirens echoed through the trees, the Colemans stood quietly on the edge of a damp airstrip in northern Washington. Anthony zipped up his duffel, checking his watch. Grace held Noah gently against her chest, humming a soft tune, her scarf fluttering in the wind. It was meant to be a peaceful escape. One weekend by the lake. No screens, no emails, just the three of them. The flight they booked was through a small private charter company, Pacific Crest Air, cheap, local, efficient. The sales rep had insisted the aircraft was fully serviced, despite one recent report about oil pressure irregularities and a cabin pressure misread that had been flagged but never followed up. Anthony had seen it. Grace had asked, but the rep had smiled. Just procedural. Happens all the time. You'll be fine. And so they boarded. The plane was aging. Narrow aisle, scratched windows, an overhead bin that wouldn't latch properly. The cockpit door stayed ajar as the pilot, Rick Holloway, ran through his pre-flight checklist half aloud, glancing at a blinking amber indicator, then giving it a hard tap. The light went off. He didn't log it. Again, for a while the sky stayed calm. The hum of the engines lulled Noah to sleep. His stuffed bear wedged beside his face. Grace leaned her head on Anthony's shoulder. The mountains beneath them passed in silence. But then a sound, a low shudder in the cabin, a flicker in the lights. The left engine gave a single, ugly cough. Anthony looked up. Did you feel? Grace nodded. Something just skipped. The intercom buzzed with static. Then silence. Inside the cockpit, Rick's jaw tightened. The amber warning light was back. Brighter. Flashing. He tried to reset the system. Flipped a switch, then another. Nothing changed. The left engine began to fail. Altitude dropped. He reached for the radio. Mayday. This is Charter 402. Experiencing engine stall. Requesting immediate. Silence. The signal didn't go through. The plane dipped. A hard left roll. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead. Grace grabbed Noah tighter, cradling his head. Anthony threw his arm across both of them, gripping the seat with his other hand. The plane groaned as it began its final descent. Branches scraped the underside. Screams erupted. And then impact. The crash ripped through the forest like a blade. One wing sheared off midair. The fuselage tore as it skidded down a slope. Luggage exploded open. The cabin ruptured. Flames sparked from leaking fuel. When it stopped, nothing moved. Only wind, and smoke, and rain. One by one, the lives inside that plane went silent. Except for one, a tiny shape, curled beneath a shredded seat cushion and a slab of plastic paneling. Noah. His jacket was torn. His face was smudged with soot. But his tiny chest still rose and fell, barely. He whimpered, then cried. A weak, rasping cry. The sound of a life that didn't know it wasn't supposed to survive. He cried into a forest that didn't answer, because no one was looking. Back at Pacific Crest's operations office, the plane's last ping had dropped off radar 40 minutes earlier. An internal note was already circulating. Probable total loss. No signs of survivors. Begin quiet containment. They weren't planning a full search. Just recovery. Minimal publicity. Minimal cost. They didn't know a baby was still breathing in the cold. And if one stubborn dog hadn't heard that cry, they never would have. The wreckage had stopped smoldering. Rain began to fall again. Soft, cold, steady. It tapped against the twisted metal and the scorched leaves below like a rhythm too slow for anyone to hear. Everything else was still. No radio calls. No searchlights. No footsteps. Pacific Crest's team had pulled back their search perimeter hours ago. No signs of heat or movement, one report said. Likely all fatalities. And so, they focused on logistics, how to retrieve the wreckage, notify the families and minimize press. No one mentioned the possibility of a missing toddler. No one thought to ask. But beneath a collapsed row of seats, partially shielded by a torn cushion and a melted seatbelt buckle, a small hand twitched. Noah. His breath came in shallow gasps, the rain now soaking his hair and collar. One cheek was smeared with blood from a superficial cut. His other arm somehow still clutched his stuffed bear, wet, scorched but intact. His body trembled. The warmth was fading fast. His tiny lips parted, and from somewhere deep in his chest came the softest cry. Broken, barely audible. He cried again, not loud, not long, just enough to let the forest know he was still here, and something heard him. Half a mile away, past a slope tangled with vines and mud, a figure stirred beneath a mossy outcrop. A dog, small, filthy, forgotten. Bentley had been here before. Not this place, but this kind of silence. Abandoned months ago when his elderly owner passed away. He'd survived by instinct alone, sniffing through trash bins, scavenging outside campsites, sleeping under fallen logs. And always he had been pushed away. People yelled, threw rocks. Mutt, flee épée. Get out of here. Even when he'd wandered near the outer edge of a search base 2 days earlier, we chased him off. That stray again? He's scaring the dogs. Get rid of him. But now he lifted his head, ears up, nose twitching. There it was again. A cry. Bentley stood slowly, paws sinking slightly in the soft ground. He sniffed the air, once, twice, then began to move, through ferns and mud, across a shallow stream. Bentley wove his way through the underbrush. The sound was faint, but it was there, and growing sharper with each step. His short legs moved fast, driven not by hunger or fear, but something else entirely. Purpose. Minutes passed. The smoke grew thicker. Then he reached it. Clearing, blackened with ash. Metal debris lay scattered like bones. And at the far edge, a small shape curled under wreckage, not moving. Bentley froze. He tilted his head. Another whimper. He moved closer. Cautiously. Paused silent over the wet earth. He sniffed once. Then twice. Then again. Noah's eyes fluttered. Bentley lay down. Gently. Without sound. His body pressed lightly against the child's side, offering warmth, presence, something human beings had denied both of them. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stayed. Because in a world that had thrown both of them away, they had just found each other. Bentley stayed, not for recognition, not for reward, just instinct, pure and steady. The boy was fading. His tiny frame had gone limp, his breath shallow. The cold was tightening around him like a slow fist. Bentley pressed his body closer. It wasn't much. He was a small dog, thin from weeks of surviving alone. But his warmth shielded just enough. Enough to matter. He nudged the stuffed bear closer to the child's face. Licked his cheek once. Then again. Noah stirred. Barely. But he stirred. And Bentley stayed awake. As night fell, the forest grew louder. Wind hissed through the trees. Distant animal cries pierced the dark. At one point, thunder rumbled overhead, and the wreckage groaned, settling deeper into the earth. Bentley didn't flinch. He didn't bark. He kept watching. In the morning, Noah's lips were cracked, his hands cold to the touch. The warmth Bentley gave him had bought time, but not enough. Bentley stood. He looked out toward the trees, sniffed the air, waited. No sound, no people, no one had come. They had stopped looking. He turned back once, eyes locked on the boy, then began to move. Back at the search zone's edge, the temporary command tent had already been partially packed up. Wreckages too deep. No survivors confirmed. Let the recovery team handle it from here. Carla stood at the perimeter, arms crossed. Her radio clipped silent. Something felt wrong. She'd seen the reports, but she'd also seen the dog. 3 times now. Once near the ridge, once circling the gear trucks, and once sitting dead still outside the southern trail marker at dawn. Each time he'd stared directly at her, not begging, not scavenging, waiting. Get rid of it. You'll get bit. It's just a nuisance. She'd heard them all. But now, as the last vehicle loaded, Carla hesitated. She stepped into the woods. Just a little. Just to look. That's when she heard it. A bark. Short. Sharp. Then another. Then silence. Then the sound of something moving. Through brush. Quick. Light footsteps. She turned. And there he was. Bentley. Covered in ash and mud. Standing a few yards away. He stared at her. Didn't blink. Didn't wag his tail. Just held her gaze. Then he turned. Took a few steps. Stopped. Turned back. As if to say, are you coming or not? Carla followed. No one else came. No one believed her. But she kept walking. Bentley never rushed. Never looked afraid. He knew the way. Over a ridge. Across a fallen log. Down a muddy slope. Until the wreckage appeared through the smoke. And then the boy, Noah, pale, unmoving, barely breathing. Bentley stepped aside. His job was done. Carla dropped to her knees. Her breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her radio. This is Carla. I found a survivor. I repeat, we have a living child. Request immediate evac. And bring medics. Now. Silence. Then static. Then chaos. Behind her, Bentley sat quietly, watching. The mutt, the stray, the nuisance. He had led her here, and everything they had assumed was wrong. The medical chopper sliced through low-hanging clouds as it descended toward the burned-out clearing. Its blades churned smoke and ash into the air. Below, rescue crews moved fast. Carla didn't look away from the boy. Noah was unconscious but breathing shallow, erratic. But present. His hands were pale. His lips cracked. His chest barely rose under the emergency blanket now wrapped around him. She kept her palm against his back. whispering gently, you're okay now." Beside her, Bentley sat still, not pacing, not barking, just watching. When the medics arrived, they blinked in disbelief. "Wait, he's alive. How long was he here? And the dog? Where did he come from?" Carla didn't answer right away. She just looked at Bentley. He lowered his head humbly, as if to say, "I just did what no one else would." Back at base, chaos had broken out. The same people who had packed up gear, who had dismissed the report of barking and movement in the southern woods, were now rushing to spin the story. "The dog led her to him. You mean that mutt? The one we told her to ignore?" Carla stood in silence as the officials scrambled. One supervisor pulled her aside. "Let's be careful how this gets framed. We can't confirm anything until..." She interrupted. "Calm. I don't care what you confirm. I followed that dog. That's why that child is alive." She didn't wait for approval. She walked away. At the hospital, doctors ran fluids tests and scans. Noah was hypothermic, starving, on the brink. But he lived. The headlines exploded within hours. "Miracle baby survives plane crash. Stray dog leads rescuer to toddler. She trusted the bark. They saved a life." Photos of Bentley, still dusty, eyes deep, coat patchy, began circulating. People couldn't believe it. Some questioned the story. Others tried to claim credit. But none of them had stayed beside that child all night. Only Bentley. When they tried to take him to a shelter, Carla stepped in. "He's not going to a cage. He saved a life. He stays with the boy." There were objections, legalities, procedures, but public pressure rose fast. Thousands signed petitions. News anchors cried on air. Talk shows debated whether Bentley should be officially recognized as a rescue animal. The hospital, overwhelmed by support, made the announcement. In recognition of his role in the survival of young Noah Coleman, Bentley has been granted permanent status as a service companion and will be released to the care of Noah's guardian upon recovery. The cameras caught Carla placing a soft blue collar around his neck. A new tag, Bentley Guardian. She knelt beside him and whispered, "They called you a nuisance, but you knew. You stayed. You never left him." And Bentley licked her hand. Noah woke 3 days later. His first word wasn't mama. It wasn't dada. It was a soft, slowed, doggy. Bentley stood up on the hospital bed, nudged his head under the child's hand, and for the first time since the crash, Noah smiled. 1 year later, the news cameras were gone. The headlines had faded. The world had moved on. But in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Seattle, real life, had taken root again. A small boy with golden curls ran barefoot across the grass, clutching a worn stuffed bear in one hand and giggling with abandon. His legs still trembled slightly with each step, but they were getting stronger every day. Right behind him, trotting with quiet determination, was Bentley. His coat had grown fuller. His eyes were brighter. The limp he once had from a broken toe was barely noticeable now. Noah laughed and shouted, "Come on, Bentley." The pug barked once, then sprinted ahead, tail wagging, ears flopping, heart full. Inside the house, Elise watched from the kitchen window, her hands resting on a cup of tea gone cold. She had lost her sister in the crash, gained a nephew in the aftermath, and along with him, a dog she never asked for, but now couldn't imagine life without. Bentley followed Noah everywhere, to the doctor, to physical therapy, even to preschool orientation, where he sat calmly in the lobby, refusing to leave until the boy returned. They'd been through something no one else could understand, and it bonded them beyond words. One afternoon, Elise found a letter in the mail. It was from Pacific Crest Air, the company, a formal apology, a settlement offer, a list of procedural updates they claimed had been made since the incident. She threw it away, because no dollar amount could undo the fact that they gave up. They assumed Noah was gone. They dismissed the only one who hadn't, and tried to move on quietly. But Bentley hadn't moved on. He had stayed. That was something money couldn't buy, and something Elise would never forget. At night, Elise would hear Noah talking to Bentley in whispers. You remember the trees? It was really dark. You didn't go. She didn't always understand the words, but she understood the feeling, because whenever the boy spoke, Bentley listened, eyes steady, body still, and in that silence, everything was heard. On the anniversary of the crash, Carla visited. She brought a new collar of black leather, with gold stitching. On it, a single word, stay. Bentley wore it with quiet pride. They sat outside under fading sunlight, the boy between them, head resting on Bentley's side. Carla looked at Elise. I still hear people at work say it sometimes, that I chased shadows, that I followed a dog because I was tired or emotional or whatever. She paused, then smiled. But I remember his eyes, and the way he waited. He didn't need to prove anything. He already knew. The rest of us just had to catch up. Elise nodded. She looked at her nephew, now fast asleep beside his dog. He doesn't need to remember every detail, just that someone stayed when everyone else left. Carla said nothing more. Bentley snored gently, and the sky above them faded into quiet dusk. Because sometimes, the truest kind of loyalty comes not with words, but with presence. Not with bark or bite, but with choosing to stay, even when no one asked you to.